Their sociological theory lecture post-coronavirus. Tonight's lecture is on a theorist, Michel Foucault, and a book, the History of Sexuality, Volume 1. I've got my old edition here, the old vintage edition, that both of whom I have a kind of ambivalent relationship with. Foucault is one of those writers who has fallen in my esteem a little bit over the years, in part because he lacks a full-blown social ontology. Or to put it another way, he lacks the social realism of someone like Emile Durkheim. I think in practical terms, what that means is that Foucault is really interested in modern or postmodern subjects of power. And he sort of views people in, sort of the post-1950s, post-World War II world, the postmodern period, as subjects of disembodied techniques of domination or techniques of power. That rarely, I think, to Foucault, do we face our rulers directly, face to face. We have a hard time imagining them. We aren't responding to someone in a kind of, sort of master-slave or, bondsman, overlord manner. Instead, we are controlled, kind of, again, a term I don't mind, behind our back. Or I think even more important to Foucault, we're controlled through a kind of a series of sort of invisible traces, invisible handles, symbolic handles that are placed upon us through a variety of disciplinary institutions and disciplinary power structures. So we're controlled by weapons and levers that we cannot see, and that again, that are disembodied, that are theorized by Foucault as techniques, technologies, systems, methods. What are some other words that he uses? Practices, right? So we're not dealing here with something that can be imagined or named with a proper name or a face, right? Instead, we're dealing with something like bureaucratic structures or administrative apparatus that kind of lack a human element to them. So what that means is to Foucault, modern people are dominated by these disembodied systems of power. And so I think that's good and right and proper, but they're just, again, to me, when I read Foucault, I don't see enough society. I don't see enough grappling with, with the social ontology. So he's good at sort of articulating these systems of power that, that reach from some unnamed and unidentified place above us or alongside of us and reach deep down within us into our body and our soul. But he isn't very good at sort of situating these systems of power within something like capitalism as a named thing that's theorized overtly and comprehended. He tends to see power knowledge systems or systems of discipline or systems of control and domination as disembodied, and that they seem to have their own logic, they seem to have their own a reason for being that is disconnected from the process of capital accumulation, or and so to me it's weakened by that. All right, so there's a kind of a long discourse on the trouble that I'm having, sort of getting excited about teaching Foucault. I run into this every time I teach him. All the same, Foucault was important. He was a relatively new scholar when I was in graduate school. The book Discipline and Punish is really important. I teach it in another one of my courses, and I'll probably do a lecture on it next spring. But in my graduate theory course, I teach the History Sexuality Volume 1 for a variety of reasons that we'll hit in this lecture. And I generally, I haven't done it this time, but I generally teach Madness and Civilization. His first great book, and it's fun to read, and it's very interesting, but again, problematic in a bunch of ways. It might be good, though, to open with a quick discussion of what I think is the central sort of contribution of madness and civilization to sort of critical social theory, right? Marxist scholars, including Silvia Federici, have made quite a bit of Foucault's writings on the Great Confinement in Madness and Civilization. So maybe we'll do that first. But even before we do that, I think it would help us if we could sort of visualize Foucault's project and visualize the reason why Foucault is worth teaching. So the image I want you to have as we're working through both of Foucault's books is this. So this is a drawing, a rough sketch out of one of my notebooks. I just blew it up. But this is simply a wound in the symbolic order. So I was trying to sketch something out of some of Lacan's writings, and what I was attempting to do is to sort of show what happens if you have a social order, a symbolic order of language and law that literally has an empty space, a hole. And Lacan writes about this hole in the symbolic place as sort of being the space out of which psychosis emanates. Okay? In other words, the psychotic is the person who does everything possible to avoid recognizing a hole in the symbolic order. So, in Lacan's writings, he basically says that the psychotic places something like God as a kind of piece of wallpaper or something over this hole, and then they'll do anything to avoid looking directly at that hole, right? They'll deny that it's there. They'll do what he calls foreclosure, right? You'll actually try to avoid going into the location where the hole is so that you never have to acknowledge that it doesn't exist, right? Okay, so that's the kind of idea I want you to have here, that Foucault is really good at writing about holes in the symbolic order, or holes in the social structure. And generally what he writes about are these spaces that are loaded with great, I think the right word here is symbolic density or sacred density. So in Madness and Civilization, he writes about houses of confinement or asylums or I think the right hospitals. I think they were called in France, general hospitals. They don't mean what you think they mean. They're not really institutions of medicine. They're actually institutions of confinement for those who fall outside of the system of normalcy, of civilization. So he talks about, Lazar houses, the places where lepers and other infectious people were placed, created health on the outside. Madhouses created reason on the outside. The unemployed were thrown in, creating something like the bourgeois work order on the outside, right? Prisoners were placed inside, creating the legal order on the outside, and so on. So there is some space in the symbolic order, some hole in the symbolic order, into which some subjects are placed. And once inside of that space, they become both a negative example, a reason to avoid that space, and then they also become, as Foucault writes about in Madness and Civilization, they become subject to a whole bunch of disciplinary controls in the whole. And the only way out of the whole is to, in essence, take on the symbolic structure of the world surrounding the whole. So, we'll just take, so like if you go into prison, the only way out of prison might be the ending of your sentence, but if you're in a workhouse, the only way out of the workhouse is to basically become employable on the outside. So if you're an unemployed person or a disabled person, you're thrown into a workhouse, you're in there, and it's a pretty nasty place to be, and the only way out is to come into possession of the symbolic order on the outside and to be able to function within. So the hole in the symbolic order constitutes the symbolic order. And I think that this is something that Foucault is pretty good at, right? Theorizing the way that a symbolic order, something like bourgeois capitalism, is constituted, is made functional, made operative by using some space that's excluded from it as a mechanism of discipline, control, regulation, and management of human subjects. So in many ways, the history of the modern West to Foucault is a history of the alterations of definitions of the whole, or the primary whole in the symbolic structure. So the book Madness and Civilization, his big argument there is that the world of civilization, of reason and rationality and science and the bourgeois order, profit making and the Protestant Reformation and so on. The only way that that is instituted, civilization, is to have a space to place the uncivilized, who are then defined as the mad. And if they're not the mad, then they're the somehow sick, or they're the unemployed, and so on. And then later on, that you get other names for the holes into which people are placed. So again, you don't put initially it's lepers. So the unclean are thrown in the hole so that the rest of the world remains clean. The mad so that the rest of the world remains sane, and so on. So the history of the West, then, to Foucault, is in some ways the history of the evolution of the definition of the overt structure as defined by definition of the whole in the structure, right? So the whole serves the function to constitute the structure. It's a productive space, right? Okay. I don't know if that was a very good introduction or not. I think in the book that we're reading for today, the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, he basically argues that there is a negative whole. There's a space in society, in the symbolic order of the bourgeois world, and he specifies this. It is the bourgeois order, right? And by the bourgeois order, he means the post-Reformation, post-Enlightenment world of capitalism. It's kind of a middle-class world, not an aristocratic world of honor and fighting and chivalry and so on, and not a lower-class world of survival. It's a middle-class world of sort of the Protestant ethic, right? And that space of sort of that the overarching world of sort of asceticism and hard work and a calling and labor is a calling and all these other things, right? Value, extraction, and the making of profit. That world, recognized here by sort of this symbolic coding, is constituted by having some place, some negative space, some symbolic whole in the overarching structure that allows for, as Foucault says, it provides a way for power to grab hold of the subject through knowledge, right? So there's some way for us as subjects of modern or postmodern power to get a handle on us, right? A way to grasp us, a way to control us, right? By constructing some sort of negative space. And that negative space then is something we wish to avoid. It's usually stigmatizing in some way, and it's linked to power discourses. And so we, as subjects of a kind of differential multiplicity of radiating discourses of power, I'm using some of his language here, will do anything we can to avoid being, overmastered by those systems of power. And so the definition of this negative whole in the order really matters. Okay, and so to Foucault then, the positive normal symbolic order on the outside is constituted, or again, effectively brought into existence and operation through this whole, this negative space. Okay, so in the book, The History of Sexuality, it really is sex that is thrown into the negative whole. And since all of us have sex, and all of us have both the biological sex and sort of imaginary, identification as a sexuated being and so on, and all of us are situated within symbolic orders that have concepts of sex. The domain of sex then becomes a primary way to grab hold of the human subject. So really fast, Foucault doesn't write much or reference much Sigmund Freud in the book, even though he's there in the background through the whole thing. And in Freud's great book Totem and Taboo, which I have a lecture series on it, in Totem and Taboo, Freud argues that the incest taboo is the primary mechanism by which societies grab hold of human subjects, right? The way that you get people is by barring them, controlling them from the realization of their embodied pleasures and their imaginary fantasies, right? Their desires. So incest taboos and all of the kind of subsidiary rules associated with them, from the first society through ours, right? Grab hold of the subjects of power by structuring, again, the realization of drives and the realization of desires, right? Where are you going to be allowed to get licit or legal pleasures, and where are you going to be able to realize imaginary desires, and so on. So there is a section in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, where he talks about incest and the transformation of incest taboo. We'll talk about that in a moment. But he sort of affirms this, right? That sex is a primary way that societies grab hold of us. But in the modern world, he argues that the thing that's in the middle here, right, is it's kind of a complicated argument. So sex is what is at stake, and at early phases, what goes in the hole here are something like sodomites, or people who are perverse or sexually sinful in some way, and that the bourgeois order is constituted just like what I was talking about in the book Madison Civilization. It's constituted in a negative way. So you have the sinful inside, and you have the the grace-filled, licit, legitimate, sacred couple embedded in the social order on the outside. That was early on. But but what the book is really about is about a transformation that takes place as we slip into late modern society that's full of technology, that's full of, again, institutions and structures of power. And he argues that what goes into this hole ultimately is the bourgeois couple, the conjugal couple, the married couple who live in the parental bedroom, as he says, right? That's who goes in the hole. And that systems of power develop concepts, conceptual structures that grab hold not directly the couple that's inside the hole, but grabs hold of all of the people on the outside. So it is sexual conduct, sexual activity, sexual organs, sexual identity, sexual practices that are outside of the legitimate conjugal couple that's in here and given some privacy and so on, that then becomes the subject of sexuality. So the history of sexuality then to Foucault is the story of the unfolding of differentiated language systems and symbolic coding systems that both place some subjects in a position of normalcy relative to a power knowledge system, the legitimate, law-abiding, able, conjugal couple who winds up in there reproducing children and having something like legitimate sex, while those on the outside, all kinds of activity on the outside, wind up again getting ensnared in a variety of disciplinary structures, some of which are some of which are legal, so you have the criminal justice system, some of which are therapeutic, like psychiatry, some of which are medical, right, health-oriented, like medicine, some of which might be religious-oriented, and so on. And so there's going to be all of these different, there's education, pedagogy, and so there are these different experts who are standing in an institutional position of power, who then develop discourse, as he calls it, right, symbolic coding structures that often skirt the negative space of the legitimate couple and grab direct hold of those on the outside. But even those who are inside wind up structured by those by the rules that allow licit or legal sexuality because of the need to avoid being caught up in the web of this conceptual structure. So the whole point of that is that this image is what I want you to have in mind. I think it's why Foucault is worth reading, is that symbolic orders, symbolic structures, structures of language and law, especially those linked to the modern, rational, reasonable, civilized world, right, the capitalist world of the modern West, depend upon there being spaces and conceptual categories that are outside of that order, and into which early on the sinful or the different were thrown, and to avoid being thrown into that sort of that dungeon, that hellhole, that solitary confinement, To keep oneself from being thrown into the hole, one is then grabbed by the system, and then you begin to regulate your conduct and discipline your conduct to make certain that you don't wind up in there, right? The jail, the prison, the poorhouse, the Lazar house, and so on. And then later on, you get this different structure where the space that's inside is positive, not negative, and what you're trying to do is avoid being grasped and overmastered by legal orders, psychiatric orders, pedagogic orders, social science, even that has a language that directs itself at these objects of incredible symbolic density. Like, again, in this book, it's sex, right, which exists there at the center of the structure, and then there are all of these different. Again, should we try to complete this image? Here's the image I want. That the object, the target of a bunch of discourses is sex, the center of this web of symbolic density. And it includes, again, let's just list a few of them here. It includes pedagogy, writings and experts on education. It includes, criminal justice, police apparatus, court apparatus, corrections, and so on. It includes psychiatry. It includes medicine, right? And it includes, what else? We'll just leave that there. We'll just leave that for now, right? To a degree, it includes, something like, economic management. We'll leave that there. He tends to like to rule that out. But all of these different fields have institutional power bases outside, and then they develop a discourse, a language that's targeted at this thing of incredible symbolic density, like sex, like madness, like idleness, like disease, right? And that these discourses then are aimed at that agent or that object of symbolic density. And as the discourse approaches the object, again, it structures subject, grabs hold of subjects and structures them, right? So he writes about one of his cases, this boy we'll mention here in a moment, who winds up engaged in a sexual practice or a sex act that Foucault claims typically would not have been reported to formal agents of social control, the police. This was, and because it was, this boy winds up grabbed by the criminal justice system, by psychiatry, by medicine, and so on, and winds up dying in a hospital as he is basically being cut apart and restructured by these symbolic systems of power knowledge, right? Okay, so that's the idea that we have here. Yeah. Okay, we may come back to that image yet, but that's the basic idea that we have from Foucault. So Foucault ultimately is a post-structuralist. When I teach structuralism to undergrads, I often show images like this, that sociologists who are interested in structure are interested in looking past the surface appearance of a social phenomena or a moral object, like a commodity or a gift or sex, and seeing past the surface into an underlying structure. And the structure in sociology is usually composed of something like energy flows or systems of social relations or ritual conduct or something like that, right? In other words, there's human energy and flows of human energy that are underneath the surface. So, DNA has a structure, physics has a structure, biology has a structure, architecture has a structure, and so on. And and then so in sociology, language becomes the primary, the linguists, especially Ferdinand de Saussure, structural linguistics. And, in structural linguistics, the structure of a symbolic order in society is language, right? And so language provides the model for all other symbolic systems. Let me try to get rid of this here. Okay, so like the concept of baby has meaning because it's defined to other concepts that are related to it. Mom, dad. Mom has meaning because she's not dad and not baby. Dad has meaning because he's not mom. And then they're also not grandpa. right? Who is not young and smelling and likes beer. Dad is a man, has law. Well, I just had the word spank in there. This is ridiculous, but you get it. Mom has meaning because she's a woman, a care, has access to. Yeah, anyway, this is sort of a silly thing, but you get it that there's a symbolic structure, and that this symbolic structure, the symbols, mean something because they cut through the imagination and cut down into the real of embodied existence, and again that the concepts align with each other in something like a structure of difference. Okay, so in structuralism, there's a kind of double determination of meaning of any object that's caught within a structure, right? The kind of the warp and the weft, the horizontal and the vertical axes, right? So there's a synchronic structural relation in which, so this is kind of like a dictionary where each word in the dictionary has meaning because it's not the same as any of the other words. So mom is different from dad and grandmother and sister and milk and Mormon and all that kind of stuff, right? So, and then there's a second, and this is sort of an atemporal meaning, and then there's a second meaning that's syntactical, that arises as one symbol, a word, is used in a chain with other symbols in actual time, right? And so you get actual discourse or, something like a statement that's made. Mom wears army boots, not right. That statement only has meaning as you analyze each word in sequence with each other, right? And that provides contextual meaning. So sociologists who study structure then are interested in both this kind of synchronic order and the diachronic order that captures moral objects or human beings and situates them within something like, patterned human activity. Okay, that's what Foucault is doing with sex. So what he's interested in is the way that sex is placed inside or is overlaid by a symbolic order that alters its meaning. And so sex is something that human beings or Homo sapiens clearly had long before we had language, long before we had universities or the internets or anything else. So sex is something that sort of predates the symbolic order. So to Foucault, there probably isn't, a history of sex as a natural thing. But there is a history of the conceptual structuring of sex. And that's what sexuality is. So sexuality, the subject of the book, History of Sexuality, is really sex as constructed by or reconstructed by symbolic discourse that is linked to some system of power, right? So sexuality is sex as structured or disciplined or regulated or defined by a symbolic order, a symbolic system, right? So that's what Foucault's interested. So in some way, he's a post-structuralist. We'll kind of not really get into that here, but he is at play in the field of structuralism. He's interested in the way that symbolic orders define and construct human meaning, right? So yeah, okay, that makes sense. So these two images are really, really important. So let's again really fast look at madness and civilization. So that's the again Foucault's first great book, and I'd like to focus on page 38. Chapter 2 on the Great Confinement, which is the chapter that I think matters most. And it's fairly short, and it's had a massive impact on social science. It ends on page 64. Okay, so in this book, Foucault writes about the building of these great houses of confinement, right? These great houses of confinement. 19th century. Enormous houses of confinement. At one point, he argues on page, let's see if I can get it here, page 45, that within a very short period of time, at the beginning of the 17th, 18th century, I can't remember the year, 17th century, the Hospital General of Paris, the biggest hospital, the house of confinement, again, not a hospital to treat patients with medicine, but a place to confine those who don't fit the symbolic order on the outside, right? The place where all of the leftovers of society are thrown, all of the people who can't find a legitimate position in the social structure on the outside are thrown into these houses of confinement. So that's what the Hospital General in Paris was. At one point, it contained 6,000 persons, or around 1% of the total population, right? So a massive institution. into which all manner of people were thrown. So it included all kinds of people who were, let me see if I can get the list here. Yeah. Well, I'll just sort of put it here, but yeah, it's just the poor, the unemployed, prisoners, the insane or madmen, the sick, the able-bodied or invalid, sick or convalescent, curable, incurable, all both sexes are thrown in, so there's no segregation or no parsing of the population that's thrown in. They're just sort of thrown in as a bunch of human refuse or human leftovers, right? They're the people who do not fit cleanly into the symbolic order. And then so like 1656 is when this emerges. That's when the founding of that hospital general in Paris took place. So it was a holding pen for the poor of Paris, men, women, young, old, children, both sexes, people who are healthy, people who are sick, and so on. And these institutions exercised a kind of a passive power over inmates. Initially, it was defined, again, not as medical power. It wasn't a medical establishment, so again, the hospital doesn't mean what it does today. It was an administrative structure that held people, right? It was a holding pen, more like the concentration camps currently on the American southern border, where ICE has separated children from adults. It's just a holding pen, right? Like for refugees. So it's a juridical space, not a medical space, and it sort of existed at the limits of the law. All right, nothing medical took place there. It was juridical. So it was a place where the agents of the bourgeoisie, of the emerging pro-capitalist bourgeois order, post-Reformation order, placed people. And it was kind of a training camp, a boot camp for the proletariat. That's how it was viewed, right? So again, you have a space called a hospital, and anybody who can't find work, either in farm, factory, or field, winds up thrown into the hospital general, right? Everyone, man, woman, child, anyone. And then it becomes it's basically industrial boot camp, proletariat boot camp. So, they had pious intentions. Initially, it was a lot of reformers and good, sort of pious people. But it became a pan-European phenomenon. He lists all of these locations and countries on page 43 that developed the same kind of houses of correction in very short order, right? Page 44, he argues that these institutions became teaching workshops and factories. And so they stopped being mere houses of confinement, right? And they instead became places of employment. So that's like on page 45 and on. So you weren't allowed to just stay there if you didn't fit within the industrial order. But once inside, you were treated harshly and forced to work. So the thinking, or at least the ideology, was that we're creating you into a subject capable of existing on the outside. In practice, again, it was a very punitive kind of system. But again, it wasn't legitimated as punishment. It was legitimated as a place of kind of refuge and a place of training, right? Okay. So that's what it wound up doing. So it was a place that wound up generating labor, right? Yeah. So that's all in there. So on page 51, so by the time, it became a confinement space for surplus labor. It was a way to kind of manage the industrial army of the unemployed, to keep people from rebelling and so on. So outside of those periods of crisis, confinement acquired another meaning. Its repressive function was combined with another new use. It was no longer merely a question of confining those out of work and of giving work to those who had been confined, and giving work to those who had been confined and making them contribute to the prosperity of all, right? So it became a place of profit, even, and again, a reconstruction of work. So then there's a bunch about that. Okay. So so that only lasts really about for about 200 years or so before the workhouses are completely gone. So there you have a kind of a space. So those who are poor learned how to work. If you're idle, you learned how to work. You became the duty of the state to create the act of morality through the confinement. So it had a police function, forcing beggars, who are 1/3 of the population, to work. You don't have to throw every beggar inside. You simply have to force a certain number to work inside. And then it has a kind of deterrent effect, that the miseries of being in the hole are such that you'll do almost anything you can to stay out of the hole, right? So this was a way, again, by having this negative space, the Great Confinement shaped and built a productive proletariat, again, with this kind of harsh, abusive, punitive system. Okay. Make sense? So that's the Great Confinement. So to Foucault, he's sort of arguing that places that became madhouses, that became psychiatric wards, that became houses of correction later, places for criminals, and so on, were initially these spaces that were important because they again were the boot camp for the industrial proletariat. I think what I'm going to do is pause this, and then we'll start the next tape, or excuse me, the next recording, going right into the book.